The movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once was recently lauded as being a meta-modernist movie, not only because it oscillates between modern and postmodern themes and filmmaking techniques in order to reconstruct a form of beauty and truth, but because it brings into question a different conception of time in itself. According to Jean Gebser, an integral philosopher, the issue and question of time is one of the most important ones in an integral age. Being human means having a certain relationship to the future, whatever that is. Paradoxically, with time, our understanding of future, our perception of time seems to change. What does it mean to have a future in a world after postmodernism, which had deconstructed the modernistic and sequential narrative and the perception of the march of progress? And how should we engage with the future, individually, and socially? With me today to approach these issues are meta-modern sociologist and philosopher Daniel Görtz, author of The Listening Society, Nordic Ideology, and most recently 12 Commandments for Extraordinary People to Master Ordinary Life, and transmedia artist and performance philosopher Michael Garfield, host of the Future Fossil podcast, and previously from the Complexity podcast from the Center for Institute, which is, of course, famous for having trailblazed complexity and chaos theory. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here on this podcast of this Deep Future show. And I would like to start with you, Michael. So, as a host of the podcast called Future Fossils and writing of the series How to Live in the Future, how should we engage with the future itself?
I mean, okay, so I know that Daniel's work is secular. So I want to frame all of this as saying that, like, I don't see much of a boundary except in kind of the angle of one's disposition to the issue in question between the secular and the sacred or the profane, right? These are things that are extraordinary or bizarre or abnormal to one person are run of course for someone else. And, in that way, I take issue with things like the supernatural as an ontological category. There's the drinking bingo, ontological. So with all of that being said, I grew up with a really keen interest in and kind of an obsession with deep time and natural history and, the fossil world, and walk around imagining that the landscapes that I'm moving through were once underwater, that I'm seeing like these, ancient marine reptiles swimming around in the air that used to be water, above me. But then as an adult, I got into psychedelic futurism through the McKenna, Sheldrake, Abraham trialogues, where chaos theory, Ralph Abraham and Terence McKenna and Rupert Sheldrake were talking about chaos and complexity and prophecy and technology and the Gaian ecological thinking. And then through that, and through conversations around Ken Wilber's stuff, found William Irwin Thompson and the Lindisfarne Association, and Bill. I interviewed 3 times before his death, and he was a much closer mentor to my friend Mitch Mignano, but he was a mentor to me as well, to the degree that we were interacting intermittently. And Bill practiced Kriya Yoga for his entire life, and I feel like I adopted my understanding of the of the landscape of time from him, and he was steeped in 20th century advanced physics. He was steeped in thermodynamics and complex systems thinking, and how people were trying to reckon its reconciliation with relativity theory. This notion that there's a current or a flow or a grain in the passage of time, that things move from less entropic to more entropic, but then also that there is this the space-time manifold, and so everything exists at once. And how do you reconcile those things? And I got really interested in that because I had had a series of very potent precognitive experiences. I was witnessing all kinds of things before they were happening. And of course, this is not what you say in conversation with the president of SFI when he casually asks you at coffee one day why you made the decision to have children. And you say to him, well, I didn't make the decision. I saw my children before they were born and then was utterly unsurprised when I found out that we were going to have them. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's a rambling answer for you. But I mean, I think that for me, the really interesting question is, how do we rise to the occasion of everything that science has disclosed over the last few centuries, and then also find a way to allow it to sit comfortably with what I consider the majority of human experience on this. Eric Wargo, who I've interviewed twice on Future Fossils and has written extensively about precognitive experiences. He notes that this is actually the rule rather than the exception for people, throughout cultures and throughout historical periods. What's going on there? And how do we make sense of the fact that in some way it's very clear to most of us that there are things about the future that already exist and cannot be changed and can be perceived but are likely to be misunderstood so that they end up fulfilling themselves and you are the vector of their fulfillment. How do you take that and articulate it in a non-confrontational way with the second law, right? I think that's really interesting stuff to me. Anyway.
Super interesting answer. But okay, so but let's dig into it. So what would that mean for us in terms of engaging with the future? I mean, it's like I know what you're describing from literature, from poetry, from even psychology and all these things that you just mentioned, which are not part of the modernistic and physical kind of sense of approaching time. But again, so what does it mean for the daily life? How do you approach the future?
I mean, I'll be quick about this because I want to hear Daniel talk.
Sure.
But I recently had a really kind of intense, I wouldn't call it like a near-death experience, but it had some of the same kind of phenomenological traits where you stand just far enough outside of the slipstream of your own life to see the holographic pattern of meaning in everything that, while you're down in the fray of things seems senseless and random. And it was terrifying. These things are not always fun. And I came out of that experience really in agreement with H.P. Lovecraft, who said, that I believe he said, it is a mercy that the human mind is incapable of correlating all its contents. So I mean, I wrestle with this issue, this question that you have, which is something that people like Robert Anton Wilson also wrestled with. And Antero L.E. and Tim Leary, these psychedelic philosophers talk about there being this threshold between the personal and the transpersonal, in which everything starts making too much sense, and if you don't make the move from paranoia to metanoia, then you risk madness. So sometimes the best thing I think that a person can do, especially someone who's disposed to having these kinds of transcendent experiences, is, chop wood and carry water, to do what Ken Wilber himself and so many practitioners in the Zen tradition do when people are encountering, entities in their meditation practice, and just say, look, that's a distraction. I don't know that many people off the top of my head who are capable of really living amphibiously with one foot on both sides of this. Like either you surrender yourself to the mystery and become a voice box for it and sacrifice everything in the process, or you get on with the business of householding and corporate work and this kind of stuff. And I don't know, like there's got to be a synthesis, and I'm foolishly tilting my spear after it, but I'm sure other people have a better idea of how to do so.
Then you want to chime in?
Yeah, so maybe after your prompt, I mean, there's a lot of well, Michael, you went 100 directions. So I mean, I have some thoughts on the future and so forth, but maybe I want to take whatever entry point that you pick, Tom.
Give me a sec. Okay, so I mean, there was some interesting stuff that Michael mentioned. The sacred, the profane. How do you kind of bring that together? And so I think, like, even from the meta-modernist view. So, like, is there? What's your approach to this?
Yeah. Well, I thought we could stay on that, but I didn't know if you wanted to. I mean, given that future is the topic, not sacred versus profane, but let's talk about that, or let's say magic, religious versus secular. So
to make it a little bit more concrete, because in terms of the sacred and the profane and how we experience time, right? Because it's like, if we are like engaged in a ritual, even if it's like pre-modern, we have a kind of different conceptualization of time compared to we're sitting in a dentist chair, to use the most banal kind of example. And so, but the question still is, from a meta-modernist kind of point of view, how do you approach time? But in that context, could you elaborate a little bit more on that part? Like, how do you deal
I'm not sure. I'm not sure there is a metamodernist perspective on time. I could go into the meta theory that's being developed in ARC, the Arch Disciplinary Research Center, and maybe we can send a link to that. And it's time obviously is one of the basic categories. So if you want to find arches across the meta theories that have sprung from different disciplines, that's what the Arch Disciplinary project is about. Then time is one of the key categories. I mean, it goes across phenomenology, it goes across cognitive science, it goes across sociology, of course, and it goes across the natural sciences and philosophy and metaphysics, right, and spirituality and psychedelics, right. So obviously, if you can map out interesting ways of categorizing the ways of viewing time, that's very important. The reason I have to bite my tongue a little bit is that there's unpublished work by people who are not me, who I have access to, that who would then it takes steps to include time in a more general meta theory. However, just if we bring it back to just the metanoia position, then from the sacred and the profound would be something along the lines of so modernity's, let's say, matrix is out there and trying to pull us into some sort of Newtonian clock time, where that Newtonian clock time subsumes our our experience time, and we also view time as money, and then we should sort of invest it, right? And I mean, there's a partial truth to all of that, but it's an out of control thing, and metamodernists, like postmodernists, are, I mean, we accept modernity as a part of spirit's development, but we are also fundamentally enemies of modernity. So we want to get out of the matrix, right? And we want to break out of that prison, because it's a, I mean, from a spiritual perspective, a terrible, terrible tragedy that we get pulled into that stuff, and it's like then our whole life passes by, and what, right? It's unacceptable, basically, right? And so there's a revolutionary defense, of course, of Bergsonian time, of the eternal now, which is actually very well represented in New Age spirituality. So I'm an ironic New Age spiritual person, right? I hold a both and or metanoia perspective. I am willingly, I'm willingly making myself Eckhart Tolle's pothead, right? Even though I then resist, I oscillate back, right, to being a person who would despise the sloppy philosophy of a thinker like that, right? But if you look at that, and you see, okay, so the eternal now, if you manage to, as what's his name, Jamie Wheal, he writes a book about high states, or and it's called Stealing Fire, and he talks about their selfless, timeless, effortless, and rich moments, right? And they're timeless, particularly because we get so engaged in something, so consumed, right? That because time, from a cognitive science perspective, comes from the brain's entire processing. It's an emergent property of the entire brain, right? So if something consumes our attention very completely, time slows down, right? And I guess that's the thing. When then the time slows down and we are very consumed in something, when something is intensely meaningful to us, then there is a connection, not to prophetic future time in a very, Newtonian sense. So on Tuesday, but so on Tuesday, this is going to happen at 5:00. But the slowed down time, the eternal now, puts us into contact with potential attractor points that are deep. Like the deep now has sort of a wormhole to the future, right? You can start seeing around corners, right? You can sort of sense what's about to happen or what could happen if you commit yourself fully or truly to something, right? So I think that's the metamodernism then tries as a movement, not as a stage or a philosophy, but as a movement. It's sort of the movement of trying to create those moments and the generative social conditions or relationships that could contain those moments and could expand them. So it's a re-enchantment project, of course, but one that is then, one that comes from a place of genuine metanoia. And the metanoia, of course, has severe demands on us psychologically and the structures of everyday life that support it. So for that reason, it also goes back to what you said, Michael. Well, chop your damn wood, because have you tried meditating when your house is a complete mess? It rarely works, right? And it's like, I mean, there's something about the everyday order that you then can transcend. You have to transcend and include. and if you don't, it tends to come crashing down on you, right? So yeah, there is something there. I have other more concrete things I want to say sociologically about the future, and I think we can go there next in the discussion. But I realize I just gave a monstrously long answer. So please do break in, guys.
Tom, do you want to take it? Because I definitely feel like it led me right up to a question for the both of you. So, one of the things that I found really interesting in the conversations, specifically that I held as the host of Complexity podcast, was there was this strain that really came into focus for me in my conversations with Brian Arthur, who, he's got this long history of being a prominent figure in conversations about the evolution of technology and, complex systems applied to economic theory. And he had written a paper, his latest paper to my knowledge was one on how it was almost like explicitly reconstructive postmodern in its approach to seeing mathematical frameworks as tools that enact and disclose different economic world spaces and possibility manifolds. And it was about how the problems of kind of neoclassical economics are that it's using algebra, it's using words, and I mean nouns. It's using nouns in the relations between economic objects and actors. And that the advent of computation, as modern computation anyway, enabled thinking about algorithms as a basis for economic theory. And so we're talking about a kind of, I think like some of the more interesting papers that were coming out of SFI actually specifically mentioned Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy, and like what happens, in that Bucky Fuller, I seem to be a verb kind of transition, where he's talking about in the economics through nouns and verbs, he mentions, the difference between an X-ray and, like tracking blood flows and how they disclose different ideas of the human body. And in a conversation with Brian Arthur, he brought up to me this work by physicist Nicholas Geesin, who was trying to revive a kind of Bergsonian approach to time by questioning mathematical Platonism and basically saying, like, maybe real numbers, like if you think about pi, like maybe pi doesn't exist as an object, to the 10 billionth place until we have computed its value to the 10 billionth place. And so, the problem with physics as it stands, according to Geesin, is that physics cannot accommodate for the passage of time. We know the quote unquote passage of time happens. There's this felt sense of movement, but where is it in the math? And so he's saying, maybe what we have is that what differentiates the past and the future, and like a way that we can restore thinking about past and future in terms of something that is capable also of accommodating the timelessness of physical math as most people know it, is by seeing past and future as being sort of derived from, or like epistemic artifacts of our ability to perform computations. And so, this is where, like, I'm curious where the two of you stand on this, because everything you just said, Daniel, suggests to me that, that there's like a both and here, where we get, I kind of see it as like a, like toroidal, that there's I don't know. I mean, I just want to pass it back over now at this point, but like the question being something to the effect of the both andness of seeing things as static again, like seeing this sort of Einstein-Minkowski glass block space-time in which everything has been and everything that ever will be is all held together in a kind of a perfect stasis. But then reconciling that with the appearance of movement and of innovation and creativity and just, these things, and that this is a very deep question that people like Murray Gell-Mann and Miguel Fuentes at SFI were also prosecuting through mathematical arguments that randomness is not an ontological category, but it's a sort of perceptual illusion, and that it had the more and less complex in the work of Jessica Flack is also maybe a perceptual illusion based on the degree to which we can peer into the microcosm or the macrocosm and actually resolve things in a way that allows us to tease apart their causal relationships. So yeah, I don't know. I'd love to know what you think about all of that, how it stands with everything else that you've said.
Well, yeah, I mean, so obviously these are very, very deep metaphysical and possibly scientific questions. It's a little difficult to know if they can be asked, or it is difficult to know whether or not they can be answered within the frameworks of science. More likely, in the future we will have better metaphysics, better meta maps from which we can frame these discussions, and thus frame more specific and meaningful questions. And within those frameworks, science will then help us test a myriad of more specific hypotheses. So, I mean, that's of course the boring answer. The somewhat more specific for my hey, my guess is as good as anyone's. My sense is, I think most philosophically inclined people, genuinely philosophically inclined people, meaning which in my parlor means that you have both cognitive complexity and spiritual depth, and these things correlate in your mind. Very few of them of today would be inclined towards, let's say, Platonist, Newtonian, or even Einsteinian models of time. I mean, the philosophically inclined of our day, and me with them, are all leaning towards more Aristotelian, Bergsonian, entropy, chaos theory, and quantum theory, ish forms of time, Heraclitus, flow versions of time, and it's much less absolute than we'd think, and I believe there is some sort of both and, but I also believe that we'll see that one truth is true at a deeper level. So, and it's probably going to be the flow truth, right? Just as an analogy, for instance, in the 1600s, they said, Descartes thought everything there can't be empty space, right? For something to exist, there had to be something that fills out the space. And Pascal thought there's vacuum around the world, around the earth, and there's a huge emptiness out there. And Descartes said that the only vacuum he can see is in Pascal's head, right? And in the end, who was right? Well, so on a surface level, Pascal was right. I mean, there's plenty of vacuum, right? But today we're seeing, well, actually, what is the measure of nothingness and so forth. Actually, for space to exist, there have to be certain properties, and emptiness is not actually empty, and there's always some sort of potential present, and it's flickering past as a sort of almost existing potential, etc., etc., or else the space wouldn't be there to begin with, right? And the space is relational to its core, so in that sense, it's not empty either, right? So in a deeper perspective, past Descartes' position was the correct one, right? So I'm suspecting we'll see similar layers of different partial truths on the question of time in the future. Now, to bring this back to something that I feel is concrete in my own little world of sociological thinking, right? I do have a sort of both andness on time and the future, particularly as well. So I already mentioned that the part about you connect to the future by being more deeply in the now, not by thinking about the future all the time, right? And what I mean there is, let's say I have like two prophecies, right? So Hansi writing that I've been doing, and my friend Emil, and we publish under the pseudonym Hansi, is prophetic, right? So there are certain, not super explicit, but we're looking in directions, and we're trying to make stuff happen in the world, right? And we're trying to sort of make self-fulfilling prophecies, or make already likely prophecies more likely by talking about them and pointing towards them. And well, then of course that raises eyebrows and raises warranted suspicions. I'd be suspicious of prophecies and prophets. In the latest Hansi book, we qualified it a little bit by saying we believe that a sane mindset for our time is to believe in ironic prophets, or be your own ironic prophet, even, right? And again, there's the metanoia, or the both and perspective. And the ironic prophecy then is, let's say, here I want to go back to, like, we have one, the Newtonian time, clock time, and we have one, the deep time, right, or time of actual process or flows, right? And here I want to say I'm an optimist in the Newtonian sense, right? In the Platonic sense, right? I believe that there really are attractor point basins of self-reinforcing behaviors and mindsets and resonances and biological processes and so forth, and phenomenological states that we can meaningfully describe as these deep patterns of history. So from animism to what I call Faustianism, roughly Bronze Age stuff, to axial age stuff, what I call post-Faustianism, to modernity, to post-modernity, and then accelerates even more before we sort of hit a roof in this sort of progression. And then there's metamodernity, and it goes faster and faster, right? Here I believe that the faster and faster, as you read the article, Tom, it looks a lot like a bifurcation diagram in chaos theory. And I don't have any other arguments than, wait a minute, they look the same. It's just, maybe it's some sort of deep correspondence here. So what I'm saying is, potentially the potential, which is the deeper, let's say, Platonic structure or potential structure of reality, is that we get out of the modern equilibrium. We go through the postmodern critique and awakening, and we reconnect at something like a metamodern equilibrium, and that's a launch pad for another story altogether about how humanity develops and technology develops and ecosystems develop.
That's
And
great. Daniel, that's great, because let me jump.
no,
Yeah,
no,
or-
no, 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 no. Sorry, Tom.
Go ahead.
I know you're the host, but there's a both and there, right? That's the Platonic side, right? And but where I was going with all of this, and why I insist so hard on on finishing the point, is that in the empirical Aristotelian, real human side of things, right? We're not going to make it to that plateau at a global level. It's unlikely that we will. Just like during antiquity, they didn't make it to modernity, even though they were almost there, right? So likely we will see some sort of postmodern Middle Ages. So that's my non-ironic prophecy, right? But I'm going to work really, really, really hard on the potential prophecy and making it as clear as possible. If nothing else, because it becomes even more important in a sort of middle age that we're going that we'll be landing in, where you have to move from Mallorca because it's too damn hot, right? I'm sorry. So that was where I was going. Now you can ask.
No,
me,
it's
Tom.
beautiful. It's beautiful because it ties perfectly in with the question that I had for both of you. And so, because I know, Daniel, and I mentioned that before, you wrote an article about how complexity theory and metamodernism kind of comes together, and you used complexity theory in order to, describe the coming attractor basins, let's say. And you, Michael, you were mentioning William Thompson before. And so in one of your articles, you quoted him by saying, evil is the annunciation of the next level of order. And I found that so beautiful and so interesting. And so what I want to do is, let's try to be a little bit more concrete now. So to both of you, where do you see this? I mean, it's not evil in the Christian sense, maybe you will allude to this a little bit, Michael, but where do you see the things that are buzzing and booming now in our society, which are kind of considered maybe evil, and like kind of the signifiers that there is a new attractor basin, a new kind of worldview emerging? And so maybe you, Michael, you can start.
Well, I'll give you just an off-the-cuff list of a few things that I have struggled with. Like you brought up how to live in the future, and there's a piece in that series called "The Future is Disgusting," which is about this. It's about my own disquiet with living through things that I was not prepared for with my training data, as it were. Even the totalizing computational metaphor I find really part of this thing that I see. My friends here in Santa Fe, including Mitch Mignano, who was Bill Thompson's grad student, they tend to cast it more in the terms of like Rudolf Steiner talking about Lucifer and Ahriman, right? Luciferic principle being the ascendant, revolutionary, unifying, and then the Ahrimanic being the fragmenting, mechanizing. These are sort of like the two aspects of the devil, right? But they, in balance, they don't create the kind of issues that that I see here. And anyway, my buddy and I have been talking about this Rudolf Steiner prophecy that this time would be the time of the descent of Ahriman, and that the mechanization of society would become ever more complete. And I was just listening to a conversation on the Concrete podcast, Danny Jones's podcast. It starts with a K, with Diana Walsh-Pashulka, who I think is one of the more interesting voices right now in the discourse around the UFO phenomenon. She's a religious scholar who's written 2 books on this, the first being American Cosmic. And Danny asks her what she makes of the fact that this latest wave over the last few years of UFO disclosures that are being initiated by the United States government. Why now? And what do you notice about the character of these disclosures? And she says, well, from a kind of comparative religious point of view, that what she observes is there's a very loud lacuna in these conversations. It's like what's not being said, what's not being paid attention to, speaks volumes about the nature of what we're living through. And what she notices is not being addressed is the fact that members of the military and the intelligence community in the United States are often having like religious experiences in their encounters with these phenomena. And that has been completely washed out of the sort of central vein of discourse about all of this stuff, which focuses entirely on technology. And so she says, look back at the institutionalization of the Roman Catholic Church out of this messy, noisy ecosystem of early Christian sects, and you see the suppression and denial of Gnosticism and of the direct experience being and how that is sacrificed in in the process of consolidating and reclaiming power under a priesthood. And so now she says it's sort of isomorphic with that, except what we're seeing is that rather than placing the emphasis on unique and exclusive access to the transcendental through the church, that what we have is unique and exclusive access to advanced mysterious technologies through secret military operations and off the books contractors. And for some reason, like the fact that you look at she's friends with Jacques Vallée, and Jacques Vallée had done all this work on the Invisible College and on deep comparative mythology and so on, tracing major characteristics of the UFO phenomenon way back through fairy lore and all of this stuff, and and through axial religions. And Diana Paschulka having extraordinary access to religious texts, like having gone to the Vatican secret archives and so on, and having talked with numerous members of the intelligence community, because they reach out to her and said, we need a religious scholar to make sense of what's happening here. But for whatever reason, that's not, the fact that there is, again, like this goes back to the, the comments on, what is secular, what is sacred, and so on. I see, again, like Bill Thompson wrote this great piece called The Borg or Borges. He's not the only one who has said this, but he's like, as machines become more lively, more apparently intelligent, more human, then the human becomes more mechanical. There's a coevolutionary process here. And, I think that, when he was talking about evil being the enunciation of the next level of order, he was talking about the parents of baby boomers objecting to rock and roll music and tattoos and, talking about, what is that noise? Well, noise, right? Like, what is noise? Noise is that which you cannot make sense of given your own priors, right? It's what you can't find a way to fit into your pattern of understanding. It doesn't necessarily mean there's no pattern in it. But every generation comes up and then declares every technology that emerges after they have matured, they call that technology, and then everything else is sort of folded into the unconscious ground of their experience. And Kevin Kelly said, we only call something technology when it breaks. So there's what I see as the sort of evil that I am struggling with as a millennial, born in 1984, is the subject of this album I'm trying to finish up this summer called The Age of Reunion, which is about my ambivalence about the the new possibilities that are opened up for us in the digital transition, and what it does to change us psychologically and socially. And the way that the last thing I'll pin on this is I heard a really interesting conversation the other day hosted by Corey Pressman at ASU with Caitlin Smith, Jeff Vandermeer, and Merlin Sheldrake on the sort of philosophical implications of mycology. And they were pushing at the end of the conversation to have a children's book that talks about fungal biological research and the networked porous self, and this movement that is happening due to our adaptations to networked digital infrastructure, where we are we're seeing people like Jaron Lanier, the inventor of virtual reality, telling us to get off our social media accounts because it makes you the terminal node of some vast Lovecraftian social behavioral control system that cannot be identified properly or stopped. The people like Cosmos Shalizi saying that the singularity actually happened over 100 years ago, that modern corporations are these sort of archons that people are fearing are going to come into being through AI, but we actually have this much earlier AI that is the selection unit of 20th and 21st century capitalism. So, I guess, what I am afraid of is the same thing I'm running toward at full speed. And out of the fascinans, right? Which is this losing the privilege of ignorance within which a modern discrete self, a self-authoring agent with undisputed free will, can be constituted, and into something that's much more kaleidoscopic and messy and unknowable. But also, it's the prosthetics thing. It's, Freud saying, every augmentation is an amputation. And so I think, everyone who is pointing out that there is a lot to celebrate, but also a lot to grieve, I find myself on agreeing with both sides of that conversation. End rant.
Well, there are many things that you touched upon, Michael. But I'll just go back and give a corresponding answer to what you were saying, what you were asking, Tom, right, about let's say science in our time, or however you want to say it, and how we read those signs. And I want to say that when I maybe some years ago, up until roughly 2015, 16, I read this science more optimistically. I have to say, right? I think there was a lot of crazy that hadn't yet surfaced. And if you were part of let's say metamodernist, etc., or integral circles, and you try to make projects in those directions happen and push for them, you could have little premonitions, little experiences, right? And that tipped you off that things are going to go somewhat crazy before they go towards some sort of sanity, which, if you stop and think about it, isn't so hard, isn't so strange. But I, for instance, remember having nightmares when I was trying to start in integral political party. That actually I was the fascist, right? I was like all about deep democracy, all about deepening the processes of communication, all about helping people show up more authentically, all about creating a process that could sensitively hold different positions and then reach as high as you could on a deliberative ladder, I guess. But well, I sense that there would be some sort of totalitarian ghost coming up, right? And within a few years, it became clear that there are actually real risks in the developmental landscape that was mapped out by the integral theorists, for instance, and by Ken Wilber, and that they were not accounted for in the theories. That there's, for instance, if a certain stage, for instance, postmodern collapses, it collapses 4 stages down, so it's down to some sort of earlier correspondence. Which so many postmodernists, literally also anthropologists, they sometimes go native, which means they become purple in that categorization. And for metamodernists or integralists, they actually become fascists and they become red in that categorization. You collapse 4 stages down, right? And we've seen massive such collapses, including of mental health issues, and we have seen suicides, we have seen collapses of communities, we have seen the discoveries of cults, we have seen the rise of something called the meta-right, which, I mean, it's not a huge thing, but it's a thing on the internet, and they try to crawl into all the metamodernism and similar Facebook groups and nudge the discussions. They've ruined a couple of these things. Luckily, one of their leaders peed their pants on a rally, and that got them to lose momentum for a while. But I mean, well, I mean, seeing all of that, well, because life is always more tremendous than we think, in the good sense and the bad sense, and the universe is always a greater surprise than we could even imagine. Then, of course, the roller coaster ride has real downs and real ups, right? I think the challenge right now is to see the signs and to contain both sides. So it's easy to lose faith or resolve in the face of nasty stuff showing up, like, well, literal fascists who try to be part of the same things or identify with the same things or thoughts, and mental health issues and suicides and all those very, very serious things, cults, right, abuses, and of course people just having highly talented people getting stuck in precarious situations because the later meta memes, let's say, or meta value memes, they jive so poorly with mainstream society. So there's that whole dynamic, right? So all of those things, of course, give pause and give us reason to take the challenges very, 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 very seriously, right? With hopefully without becoming too serious people, because people like us, we rely on play to function and to stay sane, right? So on the plus side, then, where do we see real interesting things, right? Well, first of all, just look at the shrooming of all these different, some people call it liminal web or liminal space or whatever, but I mean, it's just so many initiatives that are sort of, kind of parallel. And a while ago, I mean, we did not have huge audiences. I mean, I don't know about you, Michael, but Tom and I but they've grown, right? A lot. And not just audiences, like interlocutors, people doing stuff, right? And just this that in these circles you really do have, in a sense, deep capital, right? You have tech, you have money, you have cultural capital, you have artistry, you have the crème of the psychedelic communities, you have profound religious scholars and practitioners, like, and somehow we're all seeing each other, like, and so sort of like what. I mean, it's not crystal clear, but I mean, people are recognizing some sort of emergence, and that's wild. And at the same time, popular things are happening. Like, well, I love the movie, of course, like everybody else, Everything Everywhere All at Once. But the guys who made it, they were literal metamodernists. Like, Google their names and Google metamodernism, they talk about it, right? They took metamodernist code, and I mean, it's all over. If we could stop and analyze the movie, but it's sort of outside of the scope of this call. But it's like integralism, it didn't yet have that cultural. I mean, it went really fast on the spirituality side and reincorporated stuff from spiritual traditions, but it was not culturally mature. It didn't have all the irony and all the play that you need, and they didn't have the aesthetic sensibilities and all the cultural props, I guess, you need to stay safe in this sort of world, or this sort of, let's say, landscape or horizon, right? So, but the fact that you see these things breaking through, I mean, as we speak, this last year was the first time we had a huge popular phenomenon that came right out of this stuff, right? How many Oscars did they get? How much were they nominated for? It's crazy. So the I mean, there's some sort of, and it's not just that, right? I mean, you mentioned Jared Lanier, and he's on the same podcast. He's on the same Netflix documentary as Tristan Harris and Raz, and I mean, they both read my books, I believe, and I talked to them as well. Whatever Tristan Harris' friend's name is, and they they warn about AI that feeds directly into the work of Transdisciplinary Research Center, which says, well, if we don't have good enough meta theory, we can't contain this. And that sort of just grew out of nowhere. That meta theorists have started finding each other, right? It's not funded. Like Santa Fe Institute, like, they're rolling in money because complexity science is kosher now, but meta theory isn't yet, but it's gonna be. And we're going to win this thing, and I mean, we are, because look at it. We already set up a academic journal. So now young scholars, they're going to post their stuff on our academic journal. They're going to have academic careers, and we're going to have professors in metamodernism and meta theory and complexity applied to philosophy and the other way around. We're going to have all of these things, but it's going to take a generation. Meanwhile, of course, Spain's going to turn into a desert. and we're going to have AI solutions that run out of control on a market that's already out of control. So there are going to be those things, but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's everything everywhere all at once. That's literally the sense I get, right? I mean, we have to expand our minds to be, and if we can be in the deep now, then for a moment, we can actually handle everything everywhere all at once. Otherwise, we just have to shrink our reality back just to manage everyday life, right? So we don't, we daydream ourselves to death in car accidents, right? Yeah, I mean, what can I say? The both and of optimism, like despair, really, and faith, really. I mean, have both. What can I say?
Just a quick question. Yeah, go ahead, please. No.
I was just going to say, in passing, this was the point of me writing How to Live in the Future, because it was the fruit of frustration of over a decade of finding myself in this weird child of divorce, habitual pattern of trying to constantly counterbalance like rampant religious techno-optimism with this like fetishistic doomer kind of thinking, and and do it from a reasonably strong stance of being someone who understands a general evolutionary theory that that the adaptation of evolutionary agents is constantly looking to exploit all available energy in a system, or to these Ilioprigogine and like dissipative structures, and the more recent work of Jeremy England on life as physics and these kinds of things, that you can say, okay, yes, there's a telos to evolution, but it's a telos that finds all available possibility and then expands upon the envelope of possibility into what Stu Kaufman called the adjacent possible by through recombination. That recombinant strategies occur again and again and again in evolutionary history as a way of adapting to the endogenous complexity created by the last innovation. And so it's a both and thing. Like we're gonna like you just said, we're gonna have all of this beautiful stuff, we're gonna have all this horrible stuff, we're going to be surprised by what future generations even consider beautiful versus what they consider horrible. There's not going to be agreement on that, at least unilateral agreement. And so what does it mean to move past what Doug Rushkoff calls narrative collapse as a paranoid phenomenon, and into something that we can embrace in the way the characters of that film, the metamodern sort of crown jewel of cinema has articulated. It's like, well, yeah, we appreciate a river delta for aesthetic reasons. Perhaps there's a similar kind of biophilia that we can marshal in accepting the plurality of futures. Thanks. Sorry, Tom, please.
Oh, no worries. So do we have time for one more, or like what is your time frame like?
So for me, preferably a briefer one. I think my daughter successfully was brought to sleep, so I think that part is fine. But I'm just running a little bit out of steam. It's pretty hot here.
Right. Just one more, right? Thank you. So one question that's on my mind recently, or for a while now, actually, and thinking about the future. I was thinking about Bucky Fuller, of course, and his idea of a critical path. I don't know if you're both familiar with that idea, Michael. I think you are. Daniel, it's just an idea. What happens if you have a given society or a subset of society which is working on one goal? And he used the example of bringing people to the moon. Within 10 years, you had like a whole society working towards the goal, from the architects, from the astronauts to the people that swept the floors. And so I was thinking, okay, are we a weak society? I mean, like the problems that we have. I mean, it's a culture war, it's identity politics. We're kind of trying to find our way to deal with that. Then, of course, there's the climate crisis looming, but to solve that's not really a goal. That's that's a reactionary. No, it's like a way of dealing with a problem that we project into the future, but it's not a goal in the sort of Buckminster Fullerian sense that we say, oh no, we want to achieve something. And so I wanted to know, your stance on that. Do we need a bigger goal for a society, to create a more like Star Trekian utopian future? Or would that be something, that necessarily must verge into a form of fascism, basically, because, that's the idea, to bring all together under one umbrella. So like talking about deep future, about the next, not the next 50 years, maybe the next 500 years, are we too weak with our goals and our visions for the future? I want to hear your opinions on that.
I can go both for first, Michael, if you want, or if it's okay. Yeah, I mean, well, you know my work since before, Tom. So my position is indeed, as you say, that we have to weak or vague goals. But then I obsess throughout of like, oh, but don't go fascist on me, right? So basically, the idea is. I mean, I'm simplifying, but but for the sake of bringing it home to one point that we can hold in this one like conclusion of the conversation, it comes back to the point of metanoia, the both andness, right? That if we're not ironic and both and enough about the goal, then it does collapse into fascism, right? So between paranoia and metanoia, and fascism is a very, very, very strong human tendency, and it has to do with othering, as you talked about, Michael. And just as an example, I thought about just the other day about how strong othering is. I mean, they showed in research that fascism makes you less happy, but it makes you feel more meaningful, lots more meaning, right? So it does not. I mean, obviously, a sterner, more hierarchical relationship creates less positive affect. Like fascists don't walk around laughing all day, right? But it creates profound sense of meaning, and it's a sort of hijack of the othering mechanism, and the othering mechanism is so basic that and this was the example I thought about the other day. You walk in a cave when it's really storming and rainy outside, and you feel cozy. You start hearing the rain because there's an inside, and outside there is chaos, or is the unsafe thing, and because of that you feel togetherness. And of course, what you're after is not the crook, you're after the togetherness. So the temptation in the mind is always to create, I don't know, the Jews or whatever the crook might be, right? And artificially create togetherness and a sense of safety and meaning when things get really confusing and complex or weird, which they are doing. And now here's the really nasty part of people who do have a metamodernist mindset and have the cognitive and emotional capacities and social and privilege-wise wherewithal to work towards such goals in society. We always have to balance the risk, which might be more than 50%, that our stuff or our intention, even our own minds and corruption and their propensity to be corrupted, collapse into what essentially becomes a new iteration of fascism, right? But that being said, so you walk that thin line. Like, this is what I call the principle of liberal innocence lost. Like, boom. I mean, I'm metanoically. I mean, I'm an ironic both and. I'm not a fascist, but very, very obviously not. But I mean, I walk the line because I want holistic, and I know that if I just slip a little bit, holistic becomes totalitarian, right? It's almost the same word. Holistic sounds so nice, so cute, and totalitarian sounds so, nasty and harsh, but they're almost the same thing, and most people slip, right? So it's a heroic feat. It's a heroic spiritual feat to actually walk the line and go towards holistic. But that being said, what needs to happen then is for metamoderately inclined people to organize, help each other out, organize in complex mycelic manners, but that are strong and resilient enough to not be reduced to either, let's say, the postmodern stuff and its culture wars, or or modernity and its payrolls. And it needs to use its superior perspective-taking skill and its superior empathy to not take a majority position, but to take a strong minority position and affect all of the other parties or minorities of the whole, that nevertheless plant, boom, strike right down the middle of society, a vision, a project, right? Which is then held ironically, but sincere, but with very sincere faith, right? Or held, religiously or with revolutionary fervor, but is not necessarily held with the same narrative by all the other parties, right? So it's up to that central node to first parasite itself on the modern institutions, hijack the conversations of modernity and post-modernity by the way, providing solutions and syntheses to culture war stuff and so forth, and nudge all of those things in the direction of a large shared common project, while having open-ended immune systems to fascist corruption. This is no easy task, but it is what must be done. And that's why we have to be really, really, really kind to each other, because otherwise we can't be sane enough and can't kind to ourselves. So, I mean, number one thing is to try and keep our sanity intact, because we'll need every inch of it. Whether or not we literally are part of projects such as that, or whether or not we're just part of the transpersonal, let's say, field that makes that emerge. Every little bit of us we put out there and feed this field with can go in either direction, right? And we have to put it, we have to be ethically almost impeccable. I mean, nobody can be ethically impeccable, but we have to really, really try to act from our highest ethics, and that in itself is the attractor point in a sense, right? Like the deliberative, not the lowest common denominator, but the highest unifying principle. They can look a lot on the surface level to a lot of people. They're going to look the same. And to some fascists, they look the same, right? They're like, oh, well, we like these metamodernist people, huh? But they're not the same. They're the exact same. They're the exact opposites, right? It's on a scale where, you have debate here, you have arguments, and smearing here, campaigns here, and manipulations. There you have violence, right? And then on the far end, on the good end, let's say you have co-development, right? Deliberation, co-development, truth-seeking, right? And both ant-thinking and metanoia. And on this side, you have paranoia. And there's sort of a horseshoe, but not like the classical political horseshoe, which is just a way to pointing out that anarchists sometimes are a bit fascist. But a horseshoe where between genuine progressivity and genuine not conservativeness, but regressivity. And unfortunately, the odds are against the genuine progressivity side, because so much order to emerge, to self-organize, is always the less likely outcome, right? The disorderly things, the chaotic, the entropic things, which at the end of the day is a street brawl, or worse, nuclear war. Those are more likely. They're the more likely outcomes, because there's so many other things that could go wrong, and with all the wrenches that are being thrown in right now, like code was a wrench, but not such a bad one. It even had some silver linings in terms of the discourse and so forth. But it turned millions of people, yeah, except for killing people, but it turns millions of people batshit crazy because they were too much at home and just watching memes and stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be optimistic, but that makes faith even more important and kindness even more important. So I always come back to these things. An ironically held faith, but a non-ironically held kindness. I mean, there's nothing to be ironic about, right? I mean, be a good person in just a general empathetic sense, and that's the winning strategy, of course. But yes, I do believe we need, with that qualifier, that I'm not talking about a means that justify ends sort of thing. With that qualifier, yes, I want a huge new project, and that new project I've already called in books the listening society, right? A society that would have a higher level of welfare, so that the default developmental psychology of a general person growing up in our society would go up a value mean or 1.5 thereabout, right?
That's beautiful, and that's like the everything I wanted to say stacks as far as I can tell, real cleanly into everything that you just said, which would have been a great place to end this. So apologies for mangling it with the annotation, but that's exactly the promise of the Federation of Planets in Star Trek, right? Is that they move beyond money into this sort of this society that supports everyone to pursue the individuation and realization of everything that they can offer their society. And they it's been interesting to watch in the discourse around that franchise how more postmodern deconstructions of that original modern transcendent social ethic have really turned off a lot of the original fan base, because because the later shows are kind of revealing the fascist underbelly of that whole project. And the more interesting show, I think, of all of the previews, I mean, the new shows, Star Trek shows that have been launched, one that doesn't get a lot of discussion is the comedic cartoon Lower Decks, which is a satirical show that's told from the perspective of low-ranking ensigns and cadets and engineers living in the underbellies, where they don't have their own they don't have their own private bunks. They've got shared bunks, and so there's like finally a way. There is an ironic turn here that I think that Lower Decks actually manages this sort of meta-modern needle threading, where they constantly return to a rededication to the cause and values and project of the Federation, while nonetheless being aware of and subject to its oppression and its insanity. And I always compared working at SFI to working in Starfleet. There was this noble thing that we were all striving after, that President David Krakauer, in the last new postdocs meeting I attended in 2022, said, yes, we know that it's deeply unlikely that we will ever find a unifying theory. Like, we just do not believe in this. That you look at people like Simon Dedeo, who have tracked the levels of confidence in a single unified understanding of scientific knowledge, and how it goes up and down like the stock market. And it, like the stock market, it keeps reaching new plateaus and then crashing and then rising up to, to integrate all of the new information that has challenged unification And like, it seems that we're in this, much as you're in, you've mentioned that we're in a kind of at the cusp of a postmodern dark age. We are in a similar kind of loss of faith in not only the institutions, right, of journalism and academia and so on, the state, but a loss of faith in the modernist scientific project of unifying knowledge. And that's maybe that's a good thing, right? Because we don't want to be monocropping anything. Like, this holism. I'll end on a personal note here, which is that I like that you address that holism in its extremes becomes fascistic, and that's clearly on display, like in the festival New Agey scenes I was hanging out in before SFI, and it's on display in the spiritual struggle of so many people I know in my own generation who were told stories growing up that led them to believe that the goal was to bring yourself to work completely, to bring your full self to the office, and that has been something that I quested after for, most of my adult life. And, it's not healthy in ways that you sort of prescribed here. And so, there is, that's just riffs on, what I see as really important, much as, we know the project will fail, but we know we must try, because that's where good stuff is likely to happen. The only thing that that I feel like I can say that's not what you have said in some different way is that when we talk about the likelihood of arriving at a new kind of, a new integration versus passing down the other fork into a disintegration, lots of people, including like Tyson Yunkaporta, right, have critiqued the basis of thermodynamics and of this notion that the world is trailing into entropy. And this is what brings us full circle in the conversation about time, right? That, if there is this sort of toroidal dimension to time that allows for kind of linear passage, but also cyclicity, then it's an understanding that we arrive at by questioning the ways that the formulation of entropy production and this like widely touted movement of the universe from order into disorder depends on framing everything within a closed system. And where in nature is there a truly closed system, right? Like entropy requires a bounded cosmos that's like not exchanging information with any other bounded cosmos. And this is why the origins of life research, this is what the issue that people have wrapping their heads around, the apparent extraordinary unlikeliness of life on this planet. And yet here we are, and it happened, right? And there's something more than just the bias of that being where we stand, a kind of anthropic bias. There's this other thing, which is that we don't actually know the odds, much as like we don't know how to fill out the numerous variables of the Drake equation. Maybe there is no Fermi paradox, right? Like there are too many unknowns. And so, when I hear you talk about, the kind of, the way that the meta-modern stance must be enacted politically and socially and ethically, it's something I hear a lot of people in Gen Z talking about, like the emphasis on epistemic humility, right? And it's like, yeah, like maybe it's good for us to believe that there's less of a chance that we're going to make it through this into something better. At least maybe that's what motivates certain people to strive for it, that we have to strive for it. But I know a lot of people that are trampled by and rendered helpless by considering the likelihood of our doom. And I find myself in these conversations saying, well, it's an open system, or at least we don't know that it's closed, and so we cannot say with certainty just how likely our success will be.